because of John Hewitt's involvement with the visual arts as curator and general champion of the visual arts, curator and critic, we always involve the visual arts in this programme. We celebrate all aspects of John Hewitt, including his involvement in the arts, in the visual arts. And we have had various exhibitions over the years, and we've also had these talks or interviews. And 2 years ago we were very lucky to have with us a local artist, J B Brian Vallely. And I wanted Brian to do this for a long time, so it was one of the highlights of the summer school two years ago. And I'm glad to see that some of Brian's family are here tonight again. One of his sisters said to me on the way in, "What's the collective name for a group of Valleys?" And I didn't know what, she says, a trouble of Valleys. So I warn the rest of you that the trouble is here tonight. And he could do without trouble. We were delighted to invite Robert Ballagh tonight. And Brian will introduce Robert. And whenever we thought, Brian said to me early on, said, you have to make sure that the person who interviews him is the right person. So we sat one day and we talked about this. And I thought, okay then. And then I had somebody else in mind, and he says, you didn't ask me. So I was so glad to have Brian tonight to introduce Robert Ballagh.
Very welcome, Robert. I'm just thinking back to the first time I met you in Armagh in 1971, and I think I met you sometime before that. So I suppose I've known you for a long time, more than 50 years, mostly from a distance and reading about your
best way.
But anyhow, I only heard half of what Paul said there, and the half that I heard, I didn't believe it. But anyhow, I hope it's a sort of a challenging thing, because when you come to an artist or a painter or a creative person like Robert Ballagh, you're spoiled for choice. Where do you start? Because his career has been so diverse, so many strands to it, so many achievements right from almost from day one. And I'm going to start off by sort of going back to a period that I know very well, and from reading his book discovered that it was a source of inspiration to him, and that was in the mid-1950s when Bill Haley and the Comets and Rock Around the Clock and all this, Elvis Presley appeared on the scene and galvanised all of us as teenagers and got us interested, and we went in different ways. But Robert, he pursued the music to a very high degree, and I'd like to ask him to say something about that, the groups, the people he met, all the rest of it.
Well, first of all, I should tell you that it was my father's fault. In 1956, he said to me one evening, "Would you like to go to the pictures tonight?" And I said, "Yeah." And in a hushed voice, I think so that my mother didn't hear, he said, "We're going to Rock Around the Clock." Why there was a hushed tone in his voice was that there was a lot of talk about Rock Around the Clock, this movie, that there were riots in the cinema and seats were being broken in cinemas, and the newspapers were full of these sort of articles. But newspapers are always wont to criticise art forms that are attractive to young people. That's the way it goes, and it still continues to this day. But the funny thing is, when we arrived into O'Connell Street in Dublin, where the movie was on in the Carlton cinema, there was actually a cordon of police outside the cinema. So we made our way through. It was quite simple actually, and bought the tickets and went in. And I have to say, it was an electrifying experience for me, because you have to remember, in those days there was no TV. I knew this music from hearing it on Radio Luxembourg at night, but we never saw the people, so we didn't know what they looked like or anything like that. So to see these rock and roll musicians who we knew how the music sounded, but we didn't know what they looked like, it was really exciting. And at the time, Bill Haley was the king of rock and roll, but his reign didn't last long, sadly, because he was rather an unusual kind of teenage king, in that He had a kind of kiss curl on his forehead, and he wore plaid jackets. A rather odd-looking teenage hero. And in fact, he wasn't a teenager, he was about 30, I think. But his reign was doomed when a rather attractive-looking fellow from Memphis appeared on the scene called Elvis Presley. And I think most of us, our affections shifted fairly quickly to Elvis. And as I say, I was enraptured by this music and decided I had to take part in it in some shape or form. Even though I had never studied music or knew nothing really about music, but I saved up £5 and went into Dublin town and bought a guitar for £5 and struggled to teach myself how to play the guitar. And then something happened which for me was very, very useful, in that a music form called skiffle came along and a singer called Lonnie Donegan. And skiffle required, I have to say, minimal musical skills. Somebody thrashed out on a guitar, another person played on a washboard with timbals on their fingers, and another person played a homemade bass, which was basically a tea chest, a wooden tea chest, with a pole and a piece of string, and you moaned on that. So anyone could form a skiffle group. In fact, John Lennon and Paul McCartney formed a skiffle group at the same time in Liverpool called the Quarrymen. But I formed a skiffle group, and that was kind of the start of my musical career.
Well, that's extremely interesting, because my musical career, if you like, also started at that time. But I then, after being totally sold on Elvis Presley and Duane and all the Buddy Holly, the whole lot, I suddenly heard a recording of Sean O'Reilly playing. And up to that I hadn't really had a great deal of interest in Irish music, but there was something about O'Reilly and the Boron and the Bones and that sort of connected with my music in the head, which was actually rock and roll, if you like, and that. But anyhow, Robert, you then went on to form a group which became quite famous, the Chessmen.
I in fact joined the
Chessmen. You joined the
They
Chessmen,
were already operating as a semi-professional show band group, and at the time I was studying architecture, but I felt I could combine the two, because when you're semi-professional you tend not to play any engagement that's too far away, because you have to get back the next day, time to go to work or go to study. So that all fitted in fine. I did, I think, 3 years of architectural studies, and I kind of fell out with the people who were teaching me, or they fell out with me, or whatever. At the same time, the Chessmen decided to go professional. So I changed overnight from being a student to being a professional musician. And I did that for three, maybe 4 years. And what I should say about the architectural thing was quite interesting, because, I suppose I was thrown out of the place I was studying. And about 4 or 5 years ago I was contacted. It's now turned into a university in Dublin, by the way. It's called the Technological University of Dublin. But before that it was the Dublin Institute of Technology. And the Dublin Institute of Technology contacted me and said, would I accept an honorary degree from the Institute? And I said, oh, that's interesting. And it was an honorary degree in philosophy, which is something I know nothing about. But I agreed, because I felt it was an interesting turnaround. And I remember saying at the time that this is proof that if you live long enough, you'll eventually qualify at something. What happened really was, I think Brian is interesting there, where he says that it was hearing Sean O'Reilly and his approach to traditional music that gave him a shift in a certain direction. Well, what happened to me was a similar shift, but it was a shift out of music, in that the show bands in my day, quite early on, played really popular music, rock and roll, stuff like that. And then a new music form started in Ireland called Country and Irish, which was a music form I didn't like. I remember we played somewhere in the west of Ireland, and in the course of the whole night we didn't play one tune that I liked personally. So I said, I'm out of this, I'm retiring from the music business. And in order to ensure that I wasn't tempted to go back into the music, I decided to sell, I played bass guitar by the way, to sell my bass guitar, and then I wouldn't have the opportunity to retreat back into the music. The interesting thing was the person I sold my instrument to was Philip Lynott. So I've often said since then that I never became famous certainly internationally famous in the world of music, but my guitar did. It featured in Top of the Pops and all over the world. And then I actually went to see Tin Lizzy, which was the band that Philip formed, in Dublin one night, and I noticed that he wasn't playing my guitar. So I spoke to him afterwards and I said, what happened to my guitar? And he said, it was stolen in England. So I don't know where my guitar ended up.
Yeah, so you sort of give a clue to your eventual movement into being a full-time painter from the music, and that was what you were talking, and we discussed it earlier, you know, that you hadn't gone to art college, and that, but you were saying that in the course of your architectural studies you were taught drawing, and some of that was, you know, based on drawings of classical architecture and columns and print pillars and all the rest of it. And in a way that, you see, the art college focused on drawing from the antique casts and that, you know, you were just describing, you know, doing these pillars were difficult and then shading them in with
I remember
watercolour.
when it's in the first year, one of the first projects was to do a detail of a Doric temple with a column and the capital at the top, and you had to do a graded watercolour wash one way and going the other way on the outside of it. And I remember doing some of it in college and then taking it home and trying to do it. And I remember in my room crying at my lack of skills. It was so difficult. But, you know, we continued over the course of the first year. And by the end of the first year, all of us were pretty good at architectural draftsmanship. The use of pencils and set squares and T-squares and the whole thing. The sad thing now is that that's not taught anymore, because all architectural drawings now are done on computers. And I think that's a huge loss, because a skilled architectural draftsman, or draftsperson, I should say, is a wonder to see the work they do. And, you know, for instance, if you go to the Irish Architectural Archive in Dublin, they have archived drawings of all the wonderful buildings in Ireland, and they're just exquisite drawings. And now there's nobody who can do that kind of work.
Sort of moving on, the next, I think, significant thing that happened in your life that projected you eventual course was meeting with Michael Farrell.
Yeah,
is that?
that's correct.
Yep.
More or less.
Yes.
Well, the thing I should say as well is that in those days, show band musicians, particularly successful show band musicians, which I was lucky to be one, you actually earned quite a lot of money. So when I retired, I had enough in the bank to do nothing, really, which greatly annoyed my mother. But I spent a lot of time hanging around in bars, doing that sort of thing. And one night I was in Toner's Bar in Dublin, which is in Merrion Row, and there was a bit of a commotion, and somebody said, oh, that's the artist Michael Farrell, he's just come back from New York. And anyway, they said, do you want to meet him? And I said, oh yeah. Turned out that he had got a very big commission to do 2 huge paintings. I think they were like 30 feet by 20 feet, huge big paintings, for the Bank of Ireland. He was back in Dublin, carousing, and looking for an apprentice or somebody to work with him. So I was introduced to him, and he said to me, would you be interested? And I said, well, maybe. And he said, well, there is a test. And I said, what's that? He said, can you draw a straight line? And I said, yeah, I think I could do that. Okay, he said, the conditions are £5 a week and all the drink you can take. So I decided that was an attractive contract, so I signed up. The only place he could find in Dublin, in fact it wasn't in Dublin, it was in Wicklow, that was big enough to hold these 2 huge canvases was Armagh Film Studios. So for 2 months he had hired a house in Killiney. Interestingly enough, the house was the house that Maureen O'Sullivan was born in. Did you ever hear of Maureen O'Sullivan?
Yes.
She played Jane in the Tarzan movies. It was her house. But I think less of the history was of interest to Michael, but the fact that the house, it was a huge big house. The rent was £5 a week, which was attractive enough for him. So I used to pick him up there, and then we'd go on out to Armagh Studios, and we'd work there, pretty hard. And I have to say I learned a lot of technical skills from Michael, but also I picked up from him what it was like to be a professional artist, what it was like, because at that stage he was married, he had a son, and even though he was a crazy guy, he was very focused on being a serious artist, and I picked up a lot from him on that. The other thing, I don't know if I picked up a great skill in drinking, but at the time they were making a movie in Armagh called The Lion in Winter, which starred Peter O'Toole and Katharine Hepburn. And every evening when we finished work, we went to the bar in Armagh Studios. I'm sad to say Katharine Hepburn didn't go to the bar, but Peter O'Toole did. And Michael, needless to say, and Peter O'Toole got on like a house on fire. So every night we had a very enjoyable few hours to finish the day. But very shortly after that, I said, God, this art thing is really interesting, I'll give it a go. Now, I knew I didn't, because I never went to art school, I didn't know how to paint. So, but I always made things, like as a kid I made model airplanes, I made puppets, I even made, when I was originally interested in the music, I made my first electric guitar. So I decided to make some objects which were, I suppose you could say, influenced by pop art. They were very bright, three-dimensional kind of objects. One was called torsos. It was a kind of abstract form of a human torso. And I put them into the Irish exhibition of living art, which was the big submission show then. And to my enormous surprise, they were selected for exhibition. And that was 1967, and that was the first time my work as an artist was ever seen in public.
We were talking about that earlier. You were inspired one day. You stood on a cigarette packet and you saw it squashed out, and you got this idea of flat art.
Yeah.
And that led then to the very famous painting, the razor blade.
Well, fashions come and go, and attitudes come and go. But then, at that time, there was a huge debate in the modern art world about flatness. That art should not be illusional, that it shouldn't be about depicting things that look real or three-dimensional. It should, a painting is a two-dimensional flat surface, and it should look flat. The main person who propounded this theory was an American critic called Clement Greenberg. And so, as I say, I'd only made a few of these objects. Taking on board all of this stuff Clement Greenberg and others were going on about, I decided, what sort of a flat painting should I make? And it seemed to me, not a joke, but certainly an ironic statement, to take a three-dimensional object, namely a packet, and then to fold it out flat, and then paint it flat. I did a few of those paintings, and also, along with that, I did a painting, it was about 6 foot by 3 foot, of a razor blade, which you can't get anything much flatter than a razor blade. And to my enormous surprise, the Arts Council bought this picture, and there were articles in the paper declaiming this decision by the Arts Council to waste taxpayers' money on this ludicrous painting of a razor blade. Not the first time I've been criticised.
Well, it's very, very true to say you can't really take a lot of these criticism too seriously. Sometimes they're just filling space and spouting something that somebody else said. But the thing was, very quickly, within a short time, you were selected to represent Ireland at the Venice Biennale. Is that?
Not Venice, Paris.
Paris. Can't get everything
And
right.
Venice is supposedly the most important biennale in the world. The Paris Biennale is for artists under 35.
Oh, right, yeah.
It's called Biennale de Jeune. But it was quite amazing. And of course, it was kind of unfair in that, the first things I made were accepted by the leading exhibition. I then had a work bought by the Arts Council, and then I was selected to represent Ireland. I said, this is great, But then I didn't sell a picture or do anything for the next 10 years. So, success can often be very brief.
Your career, some stage now, I'm trying to think chronologically, it went in a slightly different direction, and you went into the designing of postage stamps. You were selected competitively, again, to your own surprise, I think. And,
to my great surprise, I got a letter. In those days, it was the Department of Posts and Telegraphs in Dublin that commissioned the stamps. Everything has changed now. It's called On Post, and it's all changed. But in those days, it was the Department of Posts and Telegraphs, and I got this official-looking letter. And you're always nervous, a brown letter, brown envelopes. I said, God, this hasn't come from the revenue, has it? But it came from the Philatelic Committee or something, and invited me to design a stamp for World Meteorological Year. It was a really interesting project, because in those days the stamps were actually printed by the Department of Revenue Commissioners in Dublin Castle, and they had this huge photogravure machine which they used to print things like tax discs for cars and everything. So it was a very old machine but quite sophisticated, and I had previously only designed for offset litho, which is a very commercial way of printing. And this was quite different, and I discovered that you could do things with this process that you couldn't necessarily do with the commercial process. One was you could get them to do a deep etch on the plates, and you could get really vibrant colours. So the first one I did was a weather map, and it had really vibrant colours on it. And it's very interesting how if you do something that ends up in the public sphere, you are guaranteed to be criticised. And I did this stamp, and it was just, like a weather map. We see them every night now on TV. And the next day there was a letter, after it came out, a letter in the paper from this person in County Cork complaining bitterly that I'd put a depression over Cork. But the more interesting complaint was from Reverend Ian Paisley in Westminster, who demanded that the British government complain to the Irish government over this Irish stamp that didn't have a border on it. And Alec Douglas Hume, who was then the Home Secretary, answered the Reverend Ian Paisley by saying that it's a weather map, and weather maps have no political boundaries on them. But it was an interesting experience. The first kind of thing I did that was, in the public sphere was roundly criticised by some, but thankfully not by the Department of Posts and Telegraphs, because they went on to commission me to do 66 stamps after that.
Well, that's a great record. Would you have the designs or references to all of those 66 stamps?
I do, yeah. In fact, when I did the 50th one, they made a presentation to me of the 50 stamps that I had done framed up. They had a little do in the GPO in Dublin and presented that to me. So I would have a copy of all the stamps.
So, your next big entry, if you like, into the public was you were asked to design banknotes.
Yeah.
And I find it a riveting read, like, and you'd probably explain it a lot better than me, but we all use banknotes, but we never really think about how they're made, how they happen, etc. And, you got this commission, and I hope I've got this right, that the first banknote was going to include Daniel O'Connell.
Not Daniel O'Donnell.
Daniel O'Connell.
Yes.
Like, I'm hard of hearing, but Daniel O'Donnell. Didn't I say Daniel? Daniel O'Connell, right?
No.
What's in that glass? But
Yeah.
no, and it was quite interesting. You struggled for a long time. You were trying to think, how would you get an image? So tell us about that.
Well, first of all, it was a big surprise. The Central Bank of Ireland decided, because forgery was becoming much more commonplace, they needed new banknotes with new security features. So they invited, I think it was about a dozen or a dozen and a half artists and designers to submit designs for their consideration. We all got a briefing document that was the size of a telephone book, because they might be small little pieces of paper are now plastic, but they're very complicated what is put on those. But I remember, and as you say, the person they wanted commemorated on the note was Daniel O'Connell. And I kind of struggled with this on and off, and nothing was happening. And I really feared that as the deadline approached, I was going to have to write and say, sorry, nothing, I can't submit anything. And as a last resort, I went into the National Gallery on Merrion Square in Dublin, and thankfully, because I knew someone there, I asked to see were there any prints. I knew the paintings of O'Connell, I'd researched those and everything, didn't like any of them, and I asked, did they have any prints of Daniel O'Connell? And they had a whole drawer full, but they had this one by a Mezzotint printer called John Gubbins, and I really liked his portrait of Daniel O'Connell. It was really quirky. So, as you would know, it often just needs one little spark to get you going on something. And this got me going, and I, very late in the day, and I have to say, my submission was pretty rough looking, but I submitted it, and a week later I got a call to say I'd been selected. And the interesting thing for me was that the selection was done anonymously. The jury didn't know who made any of the designs. They just picked what they thought was best. So nobody could say that I had influence with the jury or anything. And then the process started to actually do the artwork, the real artwork, and boy was that difficult. The only part that I actually didn't do the final artwork is the portrait, because I discovered there are only about 6 now, obviously less, because the chap who did all our notes is now retired. He worked with a German banknote printing company. But the portrait is done with a process called intaglio, which is a kind of engraving process. And it has to be done same size. And there's only half a dozen people in the world who can do this. So everything else on the note, back and front, I drew myself, but not the portrait. But what I had to do was, first of all, do an oil painting, an oil portrait, which was presented to the board of the central bank, and they approved or didn't approve. I then had to do a drawing of my painting, and then that drawing went to the engraver in Munich. I mean, there was an interesting story there where I went over to this company in Munich with the central bank people, and I didn't speak German, some of us didn't speak German, some of them didn't speak English, and there was a lot of translating going on. And at one stage I said, because the reason we picked this, they're called Giesecke and Devrient, and at the time they used to do the German banknote, but the reason we picked them was we liked the portraits they did on a lot of their notes, so we knew there was a good engraver there. And I asked, can I meet the engraver? And there was a bit of, oh, well, okay. So eventually this guy came up and I was introduced to him, and his name was Antonio Lopez. And I was introduced to him by a German, and he spoke to German and back in English and everything. And this went on for a few minutes, and I said to him, "Hablas español?" And he said, "Sí." And so we started talking in Spanish, and the English speakers and the German speakers didn't know what we were talking about. And as a consequence, I built up a very good relationship with him. And it was really interesting the way it worked. I would send him the drawing. He would then do a drawing of my drawing and send it back to me. And if I wanted to change anything, I could change it there. And I would, but mostly, he perfectly copied my drawing. I would send it back, and then he would start engraving that drawing at the actual size of the final print. And he had I presume people like him have that kind of working relationship with their employers. If he felt anyway unwell in the morning, he didn't have to come in, because if you make one mistake, it's finished. You can't repair a mistake. So, and it takes 6 months to do a portrait. So like if you were 3 months in and you're it's gone, you know? So, but what he would do would be, he'd work on it for maybe a month or two, and he'd take a proof, and send it to me and say, "Have I any opinions? Do I want to change anything?" I had to change very few things. He was so talented, but maybe a bit more of this in the eye or whatever. And I think whatever about the design of our notes, and there were 5 of them, the portraits are top class. And when he did the only complaint he had was the second note was it the second note we did? It doesn't matter. Was of Catherine Macaulay, the nun who founded the Sisters of Mercy. And he wasn't objecting to a nun or anything, but engravers love detail and, you know, hair and things like that they can use their little carving tool with. And she had nothing, because she was a nun with a habit on. All there was a face and a habit. And but I knew at that stage the next one was Douglas Hyde. And Douglas Hyde had a big bristly moustache. So I said, "Look, finish the nun, there's a great one coming for you." But when we finished them all, he very kindly gave me a beautiful, do you know Durer's self-portrait? He did an engraving of that for a banknote, and he did a print of it and gave it to me as a present, and it was to my friend and colleague, etc. So, sometimes this happens when you develop a very good relationship with somebody. And when he retired, he went back to live in Avila in Spain. Oh, one story, sorry, just to finish the banknote story, was I was so proud, and pride leads to a fall, always. And I was so proud of this, and the day it came out, it was in all the papers and everything. And my wife and myself, the next night, went to the cinema, and we were in a queue, and there were 2 young ones in front of us in the queue, and one of them took the new £20 note out, and was looking at it, and I'm bristling and about to go, and she said, "Did you ever see anything so shite?" So I didn't say anything.
From memory then, from what I remember anyhow, there were 2 things happened. I'm trying to think of in what chronological order, but you started and you did the series of prints, based on the Goya and Delacroix and all that. Do you want to talk about those? Was they were quite significant?
They go back a bit.
Yeah.
What happened in 1969, there was real unrest in both Belfast and Derry. And the Living Art exhibition was on in Cork. And the artist Gerard Dillon was in the exhibition, and he was looking for people to sign a petition against what had happened. But he was kind of gazumped by Michael Farrell, the artist, who had won the top prize in the exhibition. I had won the prize for the best artist under 35. I should say the exhibition was to travel to Belfast after Cork, a statement saying that he didn't want his painting to go to Belfast because he was in solidarity with the people who'd been driven out of their homes and stuff like that. And this resulted in, I think, about 10 or 12 artists who were in the exhibition joining Michael in the boycott. And as it turned out, the exhibition didn't happen that year in Belfast. But the next year I was invited to show in an exhibition that was being organised called Celtic Triangle, which was to go to Scotland, Wales, Ireland, Republic, Ireland, North. And see, I had to think, do I continue boycotting or what the hell do I do? So I decided I'd try and make some pictures that would comment on the unrest and what was happening. But I didn't know what to do. So I did what I always do. I turned to art history and I looked at books and everything. And I looked at artists in the past who had to deal with similar circumstances in their own historical contexts. And I came up with, one of the most significant pictures in that regard is the 3rd of May firing squad by Goya, where you see the Spanish patriots being shot by French soldiers. And another one was Liberty on the Barricades, because in those days there were barricades all over the place, and that seemed appropriate to me, and that painting was by Eugene Delacroix. And then the other one was The Rape of the Sabine Women by David, where he portrayed the women keeping the fighting sides apart, and that seemed to me appropriate as well. So I did these big pictures. They were quite big, 6 foot by 8 foot, and they toured all the venues. The interesting one was in Belfast, in that Brian Ferran, who ended up the director of the Arts Council, was exhibitions officer, and he hung the Liberty painting in the window. They had a gallery in Bedford Street back then in Belfast. And I think that was kind of a provocative gesture by him. But when the exhibition was over, I phoned him up and said, well, were there any objections? And he said, no. Oh, there was one. And I said, who was that from? Well, he said a DUP councillor phoned up, and I thought, oh, maybe he's got the message. No, he phoned up to complain about the naked breasts in the window. So he didn't get the politics, but he got the nudity. But so the interesting thing was, very few people got the connection. The irony is now that, particularly the Goya picture, BBC made a documentary on that painting, and they included my version and made direct reference to the Troubles here. And school books in the South for kids, I don't know now, but they used to have in the chapter about the start of the Troubles and everything, that picture was illustrated. It took a long time, but eventually the connection was made, which was satisfying to me.
Something that probably most of us associate you with, because it's quite an innovative thing, and that was the series of people at galleries looking at paintings. And when we were talking today, you were explaining, which was very interesting, though, that almost came about by chance. Would you like to go over that story again?
Well, yes. Back in, it would have been maybe around 1970 or around that time, I decided to go to New York because it was the capital of the modern art world, and I thought I'd become really famous if I went to New York. And I was very fortunate that I had met a man called James Johnson Sweeney, who was an Irish American, but he was a very significant player in his time in the art world. He was director of the Guggenheim Museum in New York. He was director of the Houston Museum of Fine Arts, and really important guy. And for some reason, he seemed to like me. And I went to New York. He agreed. Well, he said, phone him, and I phoned him, and he said, would you like to come to the apartment? And I had no idea. I'd never been in New York before. But this guy and his wife, they had 2 penthouse apartments put together overlooking the East River. And I arrived, I never saw this before, or since, by the way. I arrived, and there was a guy in the lobby, and he took my coat and said, Mr. Sweeney is expecting you, and brought me over to the lift. And I go into the lift, and there's no buttons in the lift. And I went, oh. And then when it went up and the door opened, I was inside the apartment and Sweeney was waiting for me there. There was no lobbies or anything. And then I looked up and there was a Picasso there and a Matisse there. It was like being in a museum. And I remember he sat me down and then he put down a bottle of vodka and 2 glasses. And I realized I was going to be there a while. And we had a great conversation, and it was the most remarkable experience I've had in that we're sitting down looking, and I'm looking at the furniture, which is, I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Barcelona suite of furniture by Mies van der Rohe. You're all familiar with it because every posh place has these. I think a chair costs about £5,000 or whatever, but it's there, and I just, to make conversation, I said, oh, I really like this furniture. And he said, yeah, it's marvellous, isn't it? He said, this is the original suite. I said, what do you mean? And he said, Mies van der Rohe designed it for the 1927 World's Fair. And when the World's Fair was over, I bought it. So, and then when van der Rohe fled Germany after the Nazis took over, he went to the States, but he couldn't work as an architect because he wasn't certified to work as an architect in the States. So in order to earn money, he borrowed back the furniture from Sweeney and gave it to a manufacturer to make replicas of it to earn money. You know? So there was all these stories I was getting. But the really useful thing for me was that he made a whole load of introductions for me in New York with gallery owners and stuff like that. And I went to one a few days later, a guy called Ivan Karp, who I knew of because he had managed the early career of Andy Warhol, Roy Lichtenstein, people like that, because he was in a gallery called, he was the manager of the Leo Castelli Gallery, which was a really important gallery in those days. But he had set up his own gallery called the O.K. Harris Gallery. I don't know why he called it that, but anyway, I went along at the appointed time, and the secretary outside said, go into his office. So I go into the office, and there's this guy now, classic kind of New York Jew, sitting there on a swivel chair with a big cigar, swiveling around on a phone, listening to 2 phones at the same time. And he looks up and he said, hold on a second, kid, I'm expecting someone from Ireland, you know. And I'm going, I'm from Ireland. And he said, you don't look like Irish to me. And then, anyway, he said, okay, come in. And he said, do you have any material? I said, I have some slides, yeah. And he said, so I put out the slides. He said, okay, you got 2 minutes. So I give him the slides, and he's looking at the slides. And then he looks up and he says, you sure you're from Ireland? And I said, yeah. He said, nah, no art ever came out of that bog. So anyway, but anyway, he kept coming back to one slide, which was one that I only brought at the last minute, and it was a little slide of a little gouache picture of people looking at paintings in the gallery, and it was monochrome. It wasn't even in color, and it was only small. And he just kept tapping it and says, "This is it. This is it, kid." You know, and I'm going, "What's it?" You know, and he said, "You got to work on this. This is the rest is shit. This is good." You know. So I went home and developed it and produced this series of pictures that was very successful, and I had a couple of shows in Ireland. I then went and had shows, I think 13 shows in Europe of it, in Switzerland, in France, in Belgium, all over the place. And it was, as you say, almost an accident.
Time is moving on. I'm just wondering, Paul, if we can go on for a little longer, because there's a couple of very important things I'd like to ask Robert about. So, say, you think of 2 things, I don't know which order to go for, but I was struck by how you, in part of your book there, articulated what's happening in art today, you know, what's happening in art education, what's happening in the schools, the art colleges, the art world and all that. And I was really struck, I've often thought about it, but I have never seen it quite as succinctly articulated. And I'd really like to hear you say, and I'm sure I'd really like to hear you say something on that.
Yeah. I actually read something the other day which I thought was quite interesting, and that was the statement that, until the advent of modernism, art always involved craftsmanship and skills, and the appreciation in its making, and the appreciation of it always involves some appreciation of craftsmanship and skills. With modernism, that was challenged because and kind of replaced with, in terms of importance, by the notion of what the art is about, what it's saying, and the concepts involved. In other words, a conceptual view of art. And then Marcel Duchamp came along, and some of you may be familiar with the famous urinal piece where he simply went into a plumber's shop and bought a urinal and exhibited it and called it sculpture. His argument was that the artist, by simply his choice or her choice, can turn an ordinary object into a work of art. Now, maybe that was valid at the time or as a once-off gesture, but when that becomes the mainstream of art, that's when I become concerned, because certainly I feel extraordinarily dispirited most of the time, and it's very odd as someone who's passionately involved in the arts, interested in the arts, how often I feel dispirited wandering around galleries and looking into dark rooms with flickering videos on them, or a pile of rocks on the floor, or somebody's unmade bed, or a pickled shark in a tank, And I'm wondering, like at the Venice Biennale this year, the talking point of the Venice Biennale was an artist who placed on the dockside the wreck of a ship that sank, that was trafficking refugees to Europe. And I'm kind of wondering, it's a gesture, yes. What skills did the artist bring to bear on this, other than the ability to phone a haulage contractor? And that happened this year. Also this year, there's a magnificent exhibition called All the Rembrandts in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. And I went over for a few days to have a look at that. And you suddenly say, this is art. This is someone who's, with simple materials, paint and canvas, is making such a statement about the human condition. It's awe-inspiring. And give me the Rembrandt any time over the wrecked ship, And, I think things will readjust, but we've time to wait yet, I think. Too many people have an investment in if you were a collector and you bought, Tracy Emin's Unmade Bed, and you paid $1 million for it, you don't want that kind of art to go down the drain and its value evaporate. So there's too many people with a vested interest in keeping what's going on at the moment afloat, But it will change, because I think there is an innate appreciation in human beings for things that are well made, well constructed, well thought out. And I just don't mean art by that. Would anyone go and buy a car that was all buckety and, badly put together? We like things that are well crafted, well made, and I think that will come back in art.
So, what I probably want to end up in is, you were talking about Rembrandt, sort of was the clue for me, that your most recent, I think, work has been this amazing series of self-portraits in which you're, I suppose, exploring some of the issues that Rembrandt did in his lifelong obsession with self-portraits and mortality. Okay, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, they're not so recent. they were exhibited first in 2010. I was invited by the Wexford Arts Centre to put on an exhibition during Opera Week in Wexford. And it's worth saying that in Wexford that week, there are exhibitions all over the place. It's kind of like an art festival as well as an opera festival. I said, yeah, that would be very interesting. And they said, what would you like to do? And I had to think, and I came back to them with a few ideas. Now, I should say there was a very formidable German woman who was chairperson of the arts committee, and she just said, no, at all my ideas. And she said, what about an exhibition of self-portraits? And I said, God, I never thought of that. And she said, I think that'd be very interesting. So I spent 2 years, well, certainly a year and a half or 2 years, doing 8 self-portraits. And they really are, I decided, because a lot of my portraits in the past, I incorporate items that, hopefully help you to understand who this person was, what they did, or whatever. I decided in these there'd be nothing there but the unadorned self, as somebody wrote about them, and that they would show that this was a person who was aging, as we all do, sadly, and would capture something of the kind of self that I was trying to express. And the interesting thing about them is that people who don't know me at all think they're really interesting and interesting pictures. A lot of my friends hate them because they say I look so ugly in them. So I don't know. But they were very important for me at the time. And again, it was a kind of chance thing. I think that's the way life works. I've never planned anything. I mean, the only thing I planned to be was a musician. That didn't work out.
I'd really like to sincerely thank you, Robert, for being so frank and upfront about your work. I'm very conscious that we've only really just skimmed the significant aspects have been left out, but we were constrained by time. Like, for example, we could have talked a long time about your series of portraits, the other portraits, of famous people and political figures and that, and there are other aspects too, but that will probably for another day. But possibly some of you may have questions and Paul may allow a question or two. No, apparently not. So all it remains for me to do is once again to thank Robert for coming here and sharing his life with us. Thank John Hewitt for putting this on. So delighted to see you here in Armagh, Robert, again. Hopefully it'll be 50 years for the next time.
I would like to thank Brian and Robert both for that wonderful, wonderful session. Thank you very much indeed. Robert last year published a memoir called Robert Ballagh, A Reluctant Memoir. Brian has been devouring it this past few weeks, and there are some copies available. Bodie has them at the John Hewitt Society desk out there. I think it's £25. So thank you very much for coming indeed.